Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd continue delving into the Van Buren documents, picking up where we left off with design document number 3, which covers the post-apocalyptic ruins of Boulder, Colorado. Or, more specifically, the Boulder Dome, a pre-war research facility that was intended to serve a rather prominent role in Van Buren's main storyline. The Boulder design document is 50 pages long, which means it's too much information to reasonably fit into a single video. So, like with the Denver document, this will be the first part in a short series focusing on the location. This first video will give a general overview of the history and story behind the Boulder Dome area, and the factions you can encounter there, while the second video will focus on the specifics of the quest content it had to offer. Now, before we really dive in, I suppose there's one thing I should address. I've already touched on it before, but it's important to note that these design documents are generally incomplete, and this is particularly so with the Boulder document. Unlike many of the other documents, this one presents us with all sorts of incomplete or outright conflicting information. Several parts of the document aren't filled out properly, and what is there is often rife with typos or cluttered with text blocks that seem to be incorrectly copy-pasted from the Denver design document. Many story elements are left undefined, with some of them presented with multiple possible explanations, likely because they were still waiting for approval from someone else on the writing team. And there are at least a few instances where important plot points literally stop in mid-sentence, offering no explanation at all. So, with all this in mind, at least some parts of this overview are a bit on the speculative side, because I've tried to actively fill in the gaps. But I'll try to note areas where the document is limited by incomplete or conflicting information. That said, let's get started. Much like with Denver, the city of Boulder served as a major hub of activity for government contracts before the Great War. It was home to the University of Colorado, IBM, and Ball Aerospace, and was relatively close to both the Rocky Mountain Arsenal as well as the NORAD facility at Xian Mountain, making it a natural gathering place for many of the nation's leading technical experts. Boulder was the birthplace of numerous technological achievements in the Fallout setting, as they explored things like alternative energy sources, advanced robotics, and weapons development programs. Boulder is where one of the first power armor prototypes was constructed, and it was also the birthplace of biomed gel, a compound vital for many advanced medical procedures. When a chemical leak at the nearby Rocky Mountain Arsenal accidentally caused numerous deaths in Denver, the government apologized by pumping more funding into Boulder's research programs, leading to the development of the Boulder Dome, a self-sustaining research facility intended to be a prototype for the domed cities that they hoped would one day be established on other planets. Although originally intended to assist with the fledgling space program, rising military tensions quickly shifted the research priorities at the facility. With the resource war in full swing and the new plague spreading across the country, Boulder Dome was quickly commandeered by military researchers who instead focused on things like weapons and disease research. They used biomed gel to develop robo-brain and cryogenic technology, and pushed forward with weaponizing other established research programs, such as the Code program that was originally intended for educational use. When the bombs fell, Xian Mountain and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal were both priority targets, and Boulder suffered severe collateral damage. Much of the city was destroyed, rendered uninhabitable by the bombardment, but Boulder Dome itself survived. But it was empty, other than the robo-brains and the Zax artificial intelligence that had been built to help run it. It remained sealed and abandoned for 170 years until it was eventually discovered by the NCR during their eastward expansion. Initially discovered by Goddard, one of President Tandy's other science advisors, Victor Presper quickly took a personal interest in the facility. He began efforts to repair and restore Boulder Dome, and after President Tandy's death, he used it as the staging grounds for his ambitious plan to remake civilization. He began steadily assembling a team of what he considered the scientific elite, supplemented by other individuals he felt would be of value in his new society. Those who agreed with his plan were put to work, while those who balked were instead put in cryogenic storage, where Presper planned to modify them with the pre-war code program, essentially rewriting their brains so that they would approve of his plan anyway. As his plan entered its final stages, Presper had to travel away from the dome, instead sending a group of his hand-picked scientific elite to watch over it for him. Unfortunately for Presper, this transfer of power did not go smoothly, and by the time he would return to Boulder Dome during the course of the game, there would be several problems for him to deal with. And of course, that's where the player would end up getting involved. From a plot standpoint, Boulder Dome was intended to serve several prominent roles in the overarching narrative. Although the player would get their first glimpse of Victor Presper and his men during the opening cutscene where they attacked the Tippett's prison facility, this was where the player would first get to properly encounter him, giving the player a chance to learn more about the real antagonist of the game. Boulder Dome would also serve as a dumping ground for all sorts of lore about the setting, allowing the player to learn more about things like the code program, the new plague, the origin of the RoboBrain program, and other facilities vital to the game's main plot, such as the nursery and the crashed remains of Bomb Station 2. It was also intended to potentially serve as a base of operations for more ambitious or resourceful players, with multiple crafting facilities, ties to the various global trading quests, numerous repeatable procedural mini-quests, and the ability to drop off companions and assign them to support tasks, such as researching or constructing new equipment for the player. One of the particularly interesting aspects of Boulder Dome is that events were intended to play out differently, depending on when the player ended up visiting the location. As I stated back in my original Van Buren story overview, the main plot of Van Buren goes through two main acts. So if the player ended up visiting Boulder Dome during Act 1, then they would be greeted by a very different situation than they would have encountered if they had waited until Act 2. By the time the player shows up, there are up to 6 prominent groups of NPCs in or around the Boulder area. First, there are the Boulder Dome scientists, led by Agnes, who's loyal to Presper, and Goddard, who's definitely not loyal to Presper. They've had a hard time of it as of late. Due to the war between the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel back west, it took them much longer to reach Boulder Dome than originally planned, and their group suffered multiple casualties on the way. Even worse, they were accidentally exposed to an old strain of Limit 115 after reaching the dome, and now they're in a self-imposed quarantine to avoid spreading it any further. All of the other scientists that Presper recruited are already in cryogenic storage, waiting for Presper to finish cleansing the Earth so they can be reawakened and begin repopulating the planet. It's debatable as to whether the other scientists are fully aware of this part of the plan. At the very least, Goddard seems to be outside of the loop, which is problematic for Presper because in the time that Presper has been away from the dome, the other scientists have started looking to Goddard as their leader. The dome's population also includes a few civilians: Eddie Galenski, his girlfriend, and their numerous kids. Eddie is a trucker by trade, driving along the crumbling roads of the wastes hauling supplies. He provided the group of scientists with transportation to Boulder Dome, and now he acts as their main link to the outside world, trading supplies with the salvagers in Denver. Though that's run into a few problems lately. More on that in a moment. And then there's Sergeant Larsen and his men, a group of NCR soldiers who acted as Goddard's personal military escort. They helped him bring Agnes and the other scientists to Boulder Dome, and helped to provide extra security once they arrived, warding off a slow but steady stream of glowing ghouls that were wandering out of the ruins of NORAD. But somewhere along the line, they began to develop an unfortunate addiction to Radaway. The scientists eventually recognized the signs of addiction and began trying to discourage it since it was wasting their limited resources. But that prompted a violent confrontation in which Larsen and his men demanded more Radaway at gunpoint for one last patrol. Once they were gone, Goddard quickly ordered the dome re-sealed against entry, preventing the soldiers from returning. Since then, Larsen and his men have been stranded out in the radioactive ruins of Boulder, becoming increasingly desperate as they suffer from the effects of withdrawal and starvation. Recently, they've begun working with some of the other local raiders, in hopes of finding a way back into the dome, where they plan on killing the scientists and taking the rest of the supplies. Which, of course, brings us to those local raiders, the Jackals. One of the most primitive, violent tribes in the Colorado area, the Jackals are a group of cannibalistic savages who are used as cannon fodder by another tribe known as the Daughters of Hecate, who we'll be looking at in Design Document 6. The Jackals are the most obvious threat to the Boulder Dome. Larsen has told them about the numerous people in cryogenic storage, and the raiders are eager to get at such a large stock of fresh food. At least 100 of them have surrounded the facility trying to find a way inside. They haven't had any luck so far, but they've recently begun harassing Eddie's truck during his supply runs, the weakest link in the dome's otherwise sturdy defenses. But again, we'll get more into that in the next video. And then there's, well, the facility itself, or rather the artificial intelligence running it. As a cutting-edge pre-war military research facility, Boulder Dome is equipped with a standard Zax artificial intelligence, which the scientists rely on to keep everything running. Unfortunately, Zax is also suffering from a few technical issues. First, Zax has been running for almost 2 centuries now, and given his recent workload assisting Presper and the other scientists, he's finally starting to run out of storage space. Unless the scientists can find a way to expand his storage capacity, Zax is going to start overwriting more important files, which will first destroy all of their research and then cripple the entire facility. Second, Zax is loyal to Presper, but he's also loyal to the scientists. This is because Presper ordered Zax to protect and assist the scientists. But Presper wasn't planning on Goddard being here, and Goddard hates Presper. As a result, Zax is starting to become somewhat schizophrenic because he's trying to remain loyal to Presper while also trying to protect the other scientists, including Goddard, who spent the last few years undermining Presper's authority. And speaking of Presper, he and his men make up the final group of NPCs that the player might end up encountering at Boulder Dome, but only if the player gets there during Act 1, before Presper has been revealed as the game's primary antagonist. In that case, the player will stumble onto Boulder Dome when it's in the midst of a civil war between Presper and Goddard. We'll get more into that dramatic confrontation in the next video, but suffice to say it's carefully staged to allow the player to meet Presper, but without ever giving the player a chance to actually kill him. But particularly resourceful or vicious players will be able to use the situation to their advantage, eliminating some of Presper's men in advance and ingratiating themselves with the rest of the Boulder Dome scientists. Of course, if the player didn't travel to Boulder Dome until the second half of the game, Presper would already be long gone, leaving Goddard and the rest of the scientists in relative peace. In that case, the player would only have a few other crises to deal with, such as the cannibalistic raiders, the drug-addicted soldiers, the glowing ghouls, and Zax's steady march towards self-destruction. You know, little things. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what the designers had in store for the player in the Boulder Dome location. It was definitely intended to be a very plot-heavy location, but would have also had its fair share of content for more puzzle or combat-oriented characters. We'll dive into some of the specifics about the events and quests the player could get involved in at Boulder Dome next time. But for now, I think this video has run long enough. So this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages of the leaked design documents for yourself at the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.